Dan DiDio was once one of the most influential people in all of comic books. He was essentially the face of DC Comics for a very long time. He had a good reputation for keeping people informed, and there were some other things that he was really good at. But he had a really bad reputation as far as direction, i.e. when he would come up with an idea of what the direction of DC Comics would be, a lot of times it was at odds with the actual DC Comics fans. The New 52 was Dan DiDio's baby. DC fans did like the New 52 at first because it sold really well. It just wasn't executed very well. When DC Comics Rebirth came in, that was not a Dan DiDio idea. That was a Jeff Johns idea. And as soon as Dan DiDio could, he essentially sabotaged it and took it in an entirely different direction, more in line with what the New 52 was as far as Toad, and people once again walked away. He was going to do this Generation 5, 5G idea, which is somewhat admirable when you kind of look at it. He wanted to reestablish the DC universe with a new timeline where the characters would age out, and then eventually, Bruce Wayne would die or whatever. That's a great idea on the surface. But it was never something that like a studio was going to go with, because they're never going to make a Batman movie without Bruce Wayne. Why would you kill off the cash cow? So eventually he was shown the door, and we haven't seen Dan DiDio really around comic books very much for the last 2 years or so, since he was released. He did show up at Philadelphia Fan Expo this weekend. He was at some panels. I guess he was telling stories. According to the scuttlebutt, that Dan DiDio is soon to be back in the comic book business, not with DC, not with Marvel, but with a new venture with somebody that has a very recognizable name within comic books, i.e. one of the greatest comic writers of all times. Before we get into those details, I do want to talk a little bit about Dan DiDio's history and why people would likely want to be in business in comic books with Dan DiDio. Dan DiDio worked on animation before moving to DC as the editorial vice president in 2022, and was promoted to publisher alongside Jim Lee in 2010. He became the public face of DC Comics. Dan DiDio was fired by DC Comics in 2020, just as his new reboot, 5G or Generation 5, was about to be enacted. Since he was fired, he's been mostly persona non grata, although he worked at the Kubert School. Apparently, he had a 2-year non-compete clause, and that elapsed, and the word is he's returning to comic books. We know there was a reason Dan DiDio was fired from DC Comics. We had bad instincts regarding the future of the publisher and where to take the universe. We also know that there were some HR complaints. Don't know if they are specifically about him, but I think it was mostly about how it was being handled, and it was time for him to exit the company. Now, why would anyone want to bring Dan DiDio back on board in their new comic book venture? There are some really smart strategic reasons why. He has contacts with a ton of great artists. One of the things that I know that he did when he was in charge of DC Comics was he made sure a lot of these really good artists that maybe aren't A-list in the fact that people don't know their names, like a Greg Capullo or something like that, but they're really good artists that were essentially like the backbone of DC Comics. He always kept them employed, always had them on good projects that fit their style. A lot of those people have not been working for upwards of like 18 months now. And a lot of them are not happy with DC Comics and the way that they were treated after Dan DiDio left. Essentially, they forgot about him. They lost their numbers in their Rolodexes, and they started hiring lesser artists. So he knows a lot of great comic book artists that think very highly of him and the way that he's a leader. In fact, his leadership style is another thing that he really has going for him. You and I might not really appreciate the direction of New 52 or the way that DC Rebirth was killed off, but a lot of the employees, specifically the talent, whether it be writers and artists, really liked the way that Dan DiDio was willing to go out there, be upfront when there was criticism about their work, and he would basically eat it. He would say, that was my fault, that was my decision, and he would kind of protect the creators from a lot of criticism, and he would take that criticism on himself. That is good leadership. Now, what he said behind the scenes or behind closed doors obviously is between them, but that is a really good way to lead if you want people to follow you. So he does have really good leadership instincts. He has really good artistic contacts, and he's also been pitched a ton of stories over the years that I imagine weren't really appropriate for DC Comics, but would have made good comic book stories. There's no doubt in my mind that this man probably knows of dozens of unpublished comic stories that never really got picked up by DC or anybody out there that are just waiting to be brought into a new comic book publisher. And the last thing I think that he really has going for him is he's good as a face of a company. He knows how to communicate not only with the customer and keep them informed of everything that's going on. And yes, he'll eat those criticisms for the creators when he needs to as well. But he was really smart in his communications with retailers. He also kept them informed. Since he's been gone, there's like a dearth of communications with DC Comics. Nobody knows what's going on. The customers don't know, the retailers don't know, and the artists don't know. The writers don't know. If Dan DiDio was in charge, that wouldn't be happening. So he is a pretty good person to have as a face of a company. He just probably isn't good at managing, creatively wise, like a shared comic book universe. Now, with that being said, I know a lot of you are probably waiting to know, who is he partnered up with? What's going on? Who is he going into business with? Both Dan DiDio and Frank Miller attended the Fan Expo Philadelphia last weekend, and they may have had much to discuss. The word in the BarCon scene is that Dan DiDio will be running Frank Miller's new publishing business going forward. What that will be, what projects it will concern itself with, we have no idea. Bleeding Cool claims they have multiple confirmations from multiple sources. Well, obviously, Frank Miller does have an ongoing business relationship with DC Comics. His work on Batman speaks for itself. Dark Knight Returns, Batman Year One, and obviously his work on the indie scene. You know, it's turned into a lot of movies and whatnot. Frank Miller's a big deal. I imagine he's had a lot of business negotiations and meetings with Dan DiDio. I think he's made a good choice in selecting to go into business with Dan DiDio and bring him back into comics with whatever this publishing venture is going to be. Is it going to be digital comics? Is it going to be traditional comics? Is it going to be graphic novels? We don't know. But apparently Frank Miller is getting into the comic book business with Dan DiDio as a business partner and likely running the company, going out there and hiring the talent and whatnot, and sorting through the story pitches and what's going to be right for the publisher moving forward. I'm assuming it's going to be a publisher. We don't know that. I think Dan DiDio and Frank Miller could be a very interesting team, and it's certainly going to make those meetings between Frank Miller and DC Comics very interesting in the future. Perhaps he's going to start poaching off a lot of talent. I imagine that is already in the books. That is one of the reasons that you would hire Dan DiDio. You look at what's happening for AWA Studios with Axel Alonso essentially at the head. What's happened there? We have a ton of great established Marvel Comics talent that have moved over there and started creating their own shared superhero universe, because Axel Alonso had established good relationships with quality talent at Marvel, and he was able to kind of bring them over into the fold, and they are much better off right now than a lot of other smaller, newer publishers out there. I imagine that's kind of the strategy that's going on with this new Frank Miller comic book publishing thing that's going to be happening. As far as Frank Miller himself, he needs no introduction. He's a comic book legend. He's also a novelist, screenwriter, film director, and producer. Of course, he's best known for comics such as Batman: The Dark Knight Returns, Batman Year One, Daredevil Born Again, Elektra, Give Me Liberty, Sin City, Holy Terror, and 300. Frank Miller's bona fides are certainly not in question. He's on the short list as the greatest writer, artist, combo creator of all time. Like, he's right up there if he's not the best ever. Here's one of the issues with this. Is Frank Miller really hasn't written a good comic book in a long time. Like, even the last stuff that he's done with DC, the last Dark Knight Returns story was really bad. Superman Year One was actually kind of terrible. So I hope that he's not there to create. I hope he's there to fund and create his own publisher, but I hope he's not going to be like their writer. Maybe he's the one coming up with the ideas and they're hiring people to execute them. I think that could work. I think he probably still has really good ideas. He probably has a lot of ideas written down or whatnot. But I don't think anybody wants Frank Miller like writing a whole lot of comic books anymore. I wish he would just kind of chill out, relax, enjoy what you've done. The legacy is secured. The art talent was always amazing. The writing talent was always amazing. But as a creator, we all have a pride, but he's well past his. So I hope that he's not going to be saddling himself with a lot of creative duties moving forward. But I think this is very interesting. And I'm hopeful that Dan DiDio and Frank Miller can make this work and really bring some competition into the comic book industry. I'm all for it. Anytime there's more competition, everyone starts raising the bar up, and the customers are always winners. And I'm always in the customer's quarter. Now, this wasn't the only thing Dan DiDio related that happened at Fan Expo Philadelphia this weekend. I guess there was an encounter with him and CB Cebulski from Marvel Comics, the current EIC. And this is, I guess, what happened. Dan DiDio's panel at Fan Expo Philadelphia went long this weekend. The former DC Comics publisher kept Marvel fans and Marvel EIC CB Cebulski waiting at the back while he rattled through everything he is now allowed to say now that he is out of DC Comics for over a year. Dan DiDio's time did go long, and eventually CB Cebulski walked down the central aisle in an attempt to get a photo of DiDio in front of the Marvel logo, which had been popped up behind him as the next panel was getting ready, which caused DiDio to shout out, "Fuck Marvel" at CB Cebulski. Well, I'm glad the fire's still there. I'm all for a new rival for Marvel Comics. Hopefully, Dan DiDio still has that hate, that burning hatred of Marvel Comics and all they represent inside of him, and he can make this new business venture an enormous success. I say that kind of jokingly. It sounds like he was just kind of messing with him, and it was done in a friendly manner, and CB Cebulski had a good time with it and whatnot. They took the picture, I believe. So, hey, I'm all about rivalries. I'm all about competition. I'm for Dan DiDio returning to comic books. I don't like the way that he was taking DC Comics, and I think he kind of was fired at the right time. His time had run its course, but I don't believe his time in comic books has run its course. I think he still has a lot to give. And I do think he is keenly aware of the people out there that have helped shape this industry, and he's smart to keep in contact with them and keep them employed when he can. So I do think this will open up a lot of opportunities from some of the older artists that essentially for some reason have been forgotten for the last 2 years. Get in there, work some more, make a little bit of money, and continue being a professional comic book artist. I don't know what the hell DC Comics has been doing, but it didn't get better after Dan DiDio got fired. Let's put it that way. Obviously, I was singing a different tune when Dan DiDio got fired. If you weren't here for that, I've got this video here. This is one of the first kind of bigger videos that ever took off for the channel. My reaction to Dan DiDio getting fired a very long time ago. Definitely check it out. Obviously, my tune has changed a little bit. Hindsight is 2020, but definitely check this out. This is what I was thinking when Dan DiDio was fired.